You're listening to Adrian Barailee Podcast.
You're listening to Adrian Barailee Podcast.
Dr. Peck, welcome to the podcast. Tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and how is your counseling and pastoral journey began.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, thank you for having me. And I've been involved with pastoral Christian church ministry now for about 20 years, since
Oh, wow.
2005. Began doing youth and family ministry, and really had a passion for helping young people, teenagers, adolescents, as well as their families get to know Jesus. And it was actually through that process of doing ministry that, as I was telling teenagers and youth about Jesus, they were often sharing with me their personal struggles, their journey with anxiety or depression, or even instances of self harm or suicidal ideations. And although I had gone to Bible college at the time, I had found that Bible college, as equipping as that was, had not fully trained or prepared me to have and navigate some of those more challenging situations, particularly from a counseling context. So at the time, I had gone back to school to get a master's in counseling, and then later on a PhD in counselor education. So I've been in counseling now since 2010, so for about 15 years in the mental health field, primarily specializing in family counseling and marriage counseling as well.
Yeah, because as your journey, you begin from a pastor to a counselor. What is some of the things that you have find the misunderstanding that pastor have in terms of mental health?
Yeah. Well, one thing is for people in ministry, for pastors, it's very common, I find, for people in their church, their congregation, to come to them when they are facing various struggles. And while pastors generally, particularly those who are formally trained, receive a great deal of theological training, preaching training, and some counseling training, I find that in most formal training programs, that pastors get very little, if any, counseling preparedness training. So when people in their churches come to them, it may be under the assumption that, hey, I like my pastor. My pastor cares a lot about me, and I want to go to my pastor because I feel comfortable. But their pastor may not necessarily have some of the training, the skills and tools
Yeah.
to really help them then navigate what they're experiencing.
Yeah, because the developed country like United States, the most of the pastors at least are aware of what counseling is, but some of the areas where people are still very new to what counseling is, uh, like how do you define what counseling is, and what every pastor needs to know what counseling is?
Yeah, I think one thing that is really distinctive of counseling, and there's some differences of viewpoints here, certainly.
Yeah,
Many folks would talk about counseling like giving advice,
yeah,
telling someone what they should or should not do. And what I would suggest is counseling, actually, the most helpful forms of counseling, actually is very little advice giving, if any. But counseling is helping someone process the difficult things that they're experiencing. Sometimes that's done through asking really skillful questions. Oftentimes that's done through giving what we call meaningful reflections. That is to say, helping someone reflect on and better understand not just what they're thinking and what they're doing, but also what they're feeling and the significance of the emotional intensity that they're experiencing or otherwise navigating. Sometimes people come in because, for counseling, they feel that they're in distress. They're going through something challenging, but they may not yet fully know what's at the root of that. So by having someone like a counselor ask them skillful questions or reflect things back to them, they can better understand where their distress is coming from. If they're feeling insecure, or if they're feeling lonely, or if they're feeling betrayed, or if they're grieving a loss. Those emotional layers are really helpful for someone to verbalize, to process, and they can even reduce oftentimes the intensity of their emotional experience just by working with someone.
Mm. Would you say like what are some of the like a basic counseling skill set pastors needs to have, or like can you give us some of the basic needs that tools in order to recognize some of the difficulties that people are going through in order to counsel people in pastoral care?
Yeah, absolutely. While there's a great variety of
Mhm.
counseling skills, some very foundational ones I would recommend is learning how to reflect content, feeling, and meaning.
Mm.
Reflecting content is making sure that you understand what someone is saying happened. So that's the events when someone says, "I'm going through a loss," or "I just lost this person." You're making sure that you're not misunderstanding them. You're saying, "Oh, what I'm hearing is this relative of yours has passed away," for instance.
Mm.
Sometimes it's seeking clarification to make sure that you're not mishearing something.
Mm.
The second part is reflecting emotions. I think this is a skill that is developed over time, particularly in the use of specific emotional language.
Mm.
Oftentimes, I find that people describe emotions more than they name them. And there's a
Mm.
neurological difference between describing emotions versus naming them.
Mm.
For instance, it would not be an uncommon expression for someone to say, "I feel like," and then they would say, "I feel like no one cares," or "I
Mm.
feel like nobody notices me." And actually, when someone says, "I feel like," they're actually describing a thought and not an emotion. So the skillful counselor is able to hear the phrase, "I feel like no one cares,"
Mm.
and they can reflect back to the person, "It sounds to me like you're saying you feel lonely."
Mm.
And they're actually naming the emotion. And what I find is people, when they hear the word, they sort of drop their shoulders and they
Mm.
say, "Yes, that is what I'm feeling." And the empathy that they experience from someone is actually healing and soothing because they feel understood, say, in
Mm.
their loneliness or in their insecurity or in their grief, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, because I think some of the time, like now, a lot of the scholars actually also pointing out one of the most misused thing in this century right now is the word empathy,
Mm.
being way too much empathetic and losing the virtue and then the wisdom in it.
Yeah.
Like, what's the wisdom in empathy in terms of balancing it when it's too much
Mm.
and when it's too little, and then how can we balance the
Yeah.
empathy? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of misconceptions about
Mhm.
empathy, particularly from those that would discredit the idea of empathy. Empathy is not condoning what someone is doing, thinking, or feeling. Similar to what I was remarking about, say, giving advice.
Mhm.
When someone says that they've done something wrong and they feel bad, empathy doesn't let them off the hook, so to speak. What empathy truly does is validates not what the person did or what they're thinking, but simply that they're feeling something, and that which they're feeling is really hard or really difficult or challenging. So when someone says, "I feel anxious," you're not telling them, "Well, stop feeling anxious," or "just focus on the good thing instead." Empathy simply says, "I'm sorry you feel anxious. Feeling anxious is a really awful feeling."
Yeah. But also like some of the time, let's just say for example, if someone comes to me and is like, "Oh, I'm feeling really bad about this particular things," and in some of the time, like, because you are not in the situation right now, you are out of the situation
Hmm.
currently, and then if you can say just okay, maybe the person is looking into a wrong way, like only focus on what is going in bad and really sinking down. As a friend, if I can see and if I can realize that, oh well, perhaps you might need to look at into a different, because like how do we make a like a discern in those kind of situations? So we just like continue to agree upon like what they're feeling,
Mm.
or like how do you advise?
Yeah.
Uh,
So empathy is more of a starting point.
mm,
It's an entry point into relationship and connection with somebody. So when someone, say, is looking at their situation in a way, I'll use your phrase, in an unhelpful way, they could look at it
yeah.
differently. Oftentimes, if you lead with that to say, I don't think you're thinking about this in the best way,
Mm,
what people often experience is defensiveness
mhm,
or resistance, that they're not receptive to your offering of a different perspective unless they first feel understood by you. What expressing empathy does, even initially, is helps the person feel heard,
mhm,
helps them feel understood, that they experience compassion from you. And it's often, even psychologically, when someone experiences that you understand them and they feel
mm,
heard by you, that they're more receptive to suggestions, or they're more receptive to you further questioning and investigating if there are different ways of looking at something. So
mm,
instead of saying, well, try this instead, you might first validate their feeling and
mm,
say, I wonder what else you've tried, or if there's any other way to look at this, and then journey with them in that. A common phrase, and it's a quote that's attributed to lots of folks that have
mhm.
repeated this, the idea that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, and
Mm,
empathy contributes to that.
yeah. And also, can you tell me the difference between like what is the significance even between empathy and sympathy?
Yeah.
Um, how do we differ that?
Yeah. Sometimes folks use those things synonymously, and
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest that there is a distinction. The way I conceptualize the difference between sympathy and empathy is that sympathy requires a common experience. The example that I use is, if you look at a pile of dishes in the sink and you feel overwhelmed by that,
Mm-hmm.
and I also look at that same pile of dishes and also feel overwhelmed, we can sympathize with each other because
Yeah.
we feel the same about a similar experience. Empathy, however, doesn't require a similar experience. You
Mm,
can feel overwhelmed about the dishes. I can look at the dishes and say, I don't I don't feel that way about the dishes. However,
mm,
I do feel overwhelmed about other things, and I can still empathize with you to say, I'm sorry you feel overwhelmed.
mm,
So empathy doesn't require a shared experience. Actually, sympathy requires more, in that
mm,
there's a commonality in experience. I think it's really significant from a ministry standpoint to acknowledge the author of Hebrews when talking about Jesus as our high priest, says we do
mm,
not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize
mm.
with our experience, but has been tempted in every way such as we have, yet was without sin. So Jesus doesn't just empathize with us, he sympathizes,
Mm.
and he's still without sin.
Yeah, I think that's a really good like a point. Yeah, I never thought in that way. Uh, Also, tell us a little bit more about because we are talking about what counseling is and how as a pastor can recognize mental illness. What are some of the big mental issue uh, that you are seeing in churches right now, and then uh, not more of like pastors are ignoring it, but also like finding very difficult to understand some of the mental issue that people have, and
Yeah.
how can we recognize as a pastor?
Yeah. I think an important thing to
Mhm.
recognize is mental health related distress comes in so many forms.
Mm,
And sometimes we talk in the context of faith about this thing called stigma. What we really hope to do is to destigmatize. What that means is
mm,
to reduce the shame associated with having mental health related distress, particularly in the church,
yeah.
to assure people just because you feel anxious or just because you feel depressed doesn't necessarily mean, right, that you're a bad Christian or you lack faith. People who believe in Jesus, who have sincere faith
Mm,
convictions, can still worry, can still feel sad. And oftentimes they feel guilty for having those emotions. So when you talk about some really prevalent things in the church, I desire to equip pastors to
mm,
help people destigmatize the shame that they feel when navigating some mental health related
mm,
distress. Admittedly, there are some instances where the decisions that someone might be making or the positions that they find themselves in are contributing to the intensity of their
mhm,
distress. I think of addictions, for instance. Certainly, we want to help someone not be addicted to whatever it is that they're addicted to.
Yeah.
But shame is not often the way that they experience freedom.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Because I feel like in a lot of the time, we feel so much hesitant to bring some of our addiction to the church because we might afraid like how other people might gonna judge us.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think we're going to talk a little bit more about the addiction because I feel like a lot of the now major challenges are a lot of people are like addicted to phone, addicted to pornography, and addicted to like several different things. I think what as a pastor and counselor, what do you think the pastoral role would be to help make people aware more about the addiction and how can pastors or leaders help someone to navigate to break through their addictions?
Yeah. I think one reasonable thought to start with for the pastor is recognizing that based on their own skills, their own training, and their own giftedness, they may not necessarily be the counselor to that person or the final counselor in that person's life. I think it's highly skilled when pastors are able to come alongside someone, provide some foundational level of what I'll call stabilization, get them out of crisis into sort of a normal functioning. And then I encourage many pastors perhaps to refer the person, help partner with the person, connecting them with a counselor with more training or experience. That being said, pastors don't have to shoulder the burden and responsibility of counseling their entire congregation completely on their own. Oftentimes, connecting with another counselor and helping make that connection with the person is often a really good avenue to go.
Yeah. Also, like when we talk about addictions, how do we know like you're addicted to something? And then when is it we can treat it? We can just work toward with the pastors who has as a mentor. Let's just go. I have this. Let's talk about pornography, for example. I think that's the biggest issue right now. Well, I'm addicted to pornography. What when it is too much, like how do we recognize that? Oh, okay, well, it's just now out of my hand. Now I need to seek for the counselor. How do we recognize that?
Yeah.
When we need to seek counselors.
There are several criteria, right, that when we're looking at addictive behavior, some people are addicted to substances, whether that's drugs and alcohol. Some people have behavioral addictions, like you mentioned pornography. Often the criteria which constitutes an addiction are things like the behavior results in some form of impairment. It's having an adverse or negative impact on their life. Also, when they desire to stop the behavior, but they find themselves unable to do so. That's in cases of, say, pornography, when someone has a moral conflict, when they say, I recognize this as sin, I don't want to engage in this, yet I find myself having the compulsion or the addicted behavior towards it that I can't stop, or they have that difficulty.
Yeah, that's a good. So, if we not being able to stop that, so is it time to go seek the counselors?
Yeah, particularly if it's causing some distress. The person feels guilt, the person feels shame, or other types of distress may be more apparent, like when someone loses their job because of an alcohol addiction, or they lose a relationship because of an illicit substance addiction. Addictions often have consequences. And when someone's life is significantly impaired by those consequences, that may be a very good time to seek counseling.
Yeah, but also like in your experience, like how do you see as the healing process? Does it have a because I heard a lot of time like a 7-step process for healing. Is there a step-by-step process that we need to follow, or because in Christianity we just see like the work of the Holy Spirit in our life, versus in secular, like how does that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I often share with folks, particularly Christians, is that while God can certainly do anything, he often works through examples of how others have walked through something as well. So
Yeah.
God can instantaneously and miraculously heal someone. And yet, often what we see is that God's healing happens through a process. And that's not constricting that that's the only way that God can work, but it's certainly a way that God works. There's lots of processes, right? You made reference to the idea of steps. There's a lot of step programs. I think of Alcoholics Anonymous or a 12-step program where an individual walks through several things to either do or areas of hurt to reconcile with a person. One reason why those are so effective, those step programs, is because they're very thorough. They don't allow someone to avoid some difficult emotions, difficult interactions, difficult areas of relational woundedness to reconcile with someone. They often hold someone accountable, again, by virtue of being a step-by-step process that you can't just skip over or pick and choose which things you will and won't do. It's what makes some of those step programs so effective for someone. I would say, in addition to that, from a counseling perspective, we recognize both the psychological and biological, physiological elements of addiction. Psychologically, most addictions are fulfilling some underlying need. When someone is anxious or fearful or in distress, an addiction can help ease or soothe that distress. We call it self-medicating. Taking illicit drugs reduces their anxiety. It's fulfilling a need, just not in a healthy and helpful way. That's the some of the psychological element. The physiological or biological element is that someone's body actually becomes biologically addicted to the substance or the behavior. So there are ways in which their brain chemicals or the ways in which their brain is being conditioned to behave. And those are often barriers to overcome as well when helping someone navigate addictions.
Yeah, and also just to switch a little bit, because oftentimes the addiction oftentimes leads into stress and anxiety. So as a pastors, I mean, like talking about where there are less training in terms of counseling and stuff like that. So how do we recognize the when the person is stressed and anxiety? Stressed with anxiety. How do we help people to recognize that? Okay, you're probably being suffering way too much with stress and anxiety. Are there any questions that we can ask when people are very feeling uncomfortable to open up about the thing they have inside?
Yeah. Actually, I'm going to go back to something that I referenced before, and that is reflecting back to them. Listening for stressful situations, listening for fears or worries, or a word that I use often are insecurities that the person has. That's the reflection of content that I mentioned before.
Yeah.
Moving towards the reflection of feeling, helping them name those emotions. And one skill that I hadn't described yet, but the idea of helping to reflect meaning. And I find this really significant when helping people navigate stress and anxiety, because meaning is reflecting back to the person what you're hearing them say in regards to why they feel the way that they do. It might not just be that they feel stress at their job or they feel stress that they've lost their job. It could be also that the reason why that's stressful is, for instance, losing their job meant to them that they failed in some way, or now they have dishonored their family by failing in their job, and they're embarrassed to tell their spouse or their parents about the event. So it's not just that they lost their job, it's that it carries all of this additional emotional weight of shame, of embarrassment, of failure, and that contributes a great deal to anxiety and stress. when we understand what the underlying meaning is behind a difficult situation.
Yeah. Also, just to move it to a little bit new transition, when you train students who are trying to become a counselor, and when you try to train pastors to be more effective counselor at their church, what's the difference that you find, and like what are some of the techniques that you use to help people understand in those both areas?
Yeah. Oftentimes, if someone is a pastor and they have no desire to be someone's long term counselor, I often encourage pastors to simply get equipped to recognize mental health,
Mm-hmm.
to initially respond to mental health, and then get trained as to how to refer to a counselor. I call them the 3 R's: recognize, respond, and refer. That's for the pastor who's really not interested in doing long term counseling, but still identifies a need to help recognize, sort of come alongside someone initially, support them, love them like Jesus, and help them get connected to a counselor. Whereas a counseling student, someone who's desiring to move towards professional counseling, or the pastor who's interested in doing more long term counseling, that's where I would recommend a more robust training of skills and tools. And one thing that's not talked about often enough is really thorough counselor training is not just equipping the counselor to work with the counselee, but an effective counselor is also trained to better understand their own experiences so as to not project them in an unhelpful way onto the person they are working with. That's a critical component of counselor training specifically, that not a lot of pastors perhaps take the time to navigate their own personal experiences.
Yeah. Also, I think you have done a few classes on pastoral burnout as well. Like, how do we recognize, as a pastor, oh, I think I'm in a verge of getting burned out, and how can we, okay, uh, avoid the burnout before it happens?
Yeah. I would highlight that there are at least two significant elements of burnout. One is more situational, and the other is dispositional.
Mm.
Situational, we would say very practical things: when someone is stressed, when someone is overwhelmed, if they're in an unhealthy work or ministry environment, or when they are not taking good care of themselves. They're not sleeping well, they're not eating well, their thought life is full of negativity and anxieties, their relationships are suffering. Those would be situational factors which contribute to the occurrence of burnout. In those instances, we would come alongside someone in counseling and really help them better understand what areas of their life are struggling. Could it be their relationships, their sleep, their diet, their exercise, their worries or their stress or their overload, and help them strategize about how to instill effective and healthy behaviors to alleviate that type of distress. But that's just one factor for burnout. The other one that I mentioned is more dispositional. This has less to do with someone's situation and more has to do with the way they experience their situation. This is more so the pastor who has a tendency to internalize or take personally things that are happening in ministry. Dispositionally, this is the pastor who does not distinguish or differentiate between who they are in Jesus and the ministry that they do. So if someone criticizes their ministry, they take that to their identity and they feel like a bad Christian if they're not winning people to Jesus, or if they're not baptizing people, or if they're not getting the ministry results. That has far less to do with the situation and more about someone's insecurities and the way they internalize different negative aspects of their ministry experience.
Can you give us some of the references or books or any training that people can do in order to help themselves recognize about the mental issues, learning and recognizing that? Because you talk about three different R's. One of them is to be able to recognize, because some people who are not very aware of what mental different categories of mental illnesses, how what are some of the things that they can read to be a little bit more equipped in those areas?
Yeah. In terms of counseling in a ministry context, there's a lot of books. Most of them are trying to navigate counseling from some different experiences. There's one book which is the sort of more comprehensive comprehensive guide to Christian counseling. I think of Gary Collins, who's a famous author in that space. What I would recommend more so than just reading some of those books is really that the pastor or the counselor take the time to also engage in significant self-reflection. Oftentimes, it's not just having the right tools to work with somebody, but also that the person has, or the pastor has, navigated their own trials, their own griefs, their own anxieties, so as to not project those things onto the person that they're working with. So sometimes even more than tools, I recommend for the pastor to either go to counseling themselves, to learn about themselves and to process things, or that they engage in that work of reflection prayerfully, so as to better understand themselves.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for giving your time. I think this was a very insightful conversation.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
absolutely. Thank you so much for talking with me.
Yeah, thank you.